Thank you. And I'm going to put my timer on here so that I haven't actually timed this or anything, so just flag me down if I'm going way over. Thank you all so much for inviting me, and I think it was really exciting because this program is amazing, and I've always sort of been intrigued by it after hearing about it years ago from Dr. Brosius, and I was actually invited, I think one of the first times you guys invited people, and I wasn't able to come. So I was really excited to be able to come today, and I must say that I've been really impressed so far with the talks that have been given and the sort of material that you're covering, and I hope that I can just, sort of be as good or meet your expectations. I've talked to a few of you about how there's been some shifts, and you're all sort of in this interdisciplinary program, right? So some of you have been to geography talks, some to anthropology, some to ecology. The first time I went to an anthropology talk and they just read their talk, I was horrified. In geography, we did a little bit of both, but geography sort of moved more towards the reading. I've seen a lot more reading lately. I've started to do more reading. So I'm actually going to read some of my talk today, which after hearing everybody sort of, so comfortably talk without reading, I feel a little bit bad about, but I won't be doing all reading all the time. Okay, so enough of the apologies. I just want to make sure this works. No? Do I have to point it this way? Okay, the pointer works. I'll just come back for this. That's totally fine. Yeah, no worries. So as my title suggests, my talk today is really about border crossing. And I'm sort of going to use the word border and boundary interchangeably for geographers, political geographers in particular. That might be problematic, and you can call me on that at the end. But I think, being in this particular program, you're all familiar with the need to do sort of boundary crossing all the time, right? And I'm talking about border crossing as sort of this necessary act of recognizing, but not being held back by borders and boundaries of all kinds. And while you're all in an integrative and interdisciplinary program, you talk a lot about sort of interdisciplinary work, but I don't think there's often a focus on the boundaries themselves or on the sort of the work of border crossing. And I'm going to argue throughout the talk the value of actually focusing on border crossing as an object of study, understanding what that means, what it entails, and as an activity that we should actually put our attention into. When I talk about borders here, I'm talking about them materially, so on the ground, conservation borders, borders between communities, and also sort of within departments, borders between ecology and social sciences, but also conceptual boundaries as well. And to sort of understand the work that boundaries do and the work that they don't do, and to ask, sort of why boundaries are drawn, by whom, for what reasons, at what point in time, and how and in what ways people, animals, ecological and political processes cross boundaries. And how do they cross them? How do they abide by them? How do they challenge them? How do they sort of reconfigure them and sort of reshape them, right? And then to ultimately ask, what kind of border crossing should we do as people that are interested in producing sort of new, socially just and ecologically responsible conservation landscapes, right? And sort of how can following or sort of studying boundaries in terms of how they're crossed, interrogated, ignored, or otherwise transformed on the grounds, and with what effects, and how that will help us in that process, right? And so I want to, and that basically, it's important to recognize, and some of this comes from sort of watching some of you guys today talk, and I think everybody's interested in sort of what's going on at the boundaries or at borderlands, but not necessarily recognizing that we're often talking about really serious borders. Borders in sort of how we think about the world, how we conceptualize the world, how we work in that particular world, right? And so just in terms of starting with that question, if we recognize that the border exists to begin with, then we might sort of reflect on how we're entering the particular problem. So there were lots of discussions about maps today, and I think that's fantastic, and I'm gonna have some maps in here and talk about the process of, for instance, community mapping. But what if you started off with a blank map, or what if you started off with asking how people conceptualize space? Instead, that's a recognition that you're sort of talking about two very different ways of being in the world, as opposed to starting with a preconceived notion that we're just actually having a conversation within one particular space, and this is the map, now draw me what goes on in that space, right? And I'll talk more about that as I sort of move forward. So I'm going to have a lot of pretty pictures and not too much text. So in some ways, my talk today is both within the tradition of political ecology, and I think that's probably part of why I got invited, but that works on sort of drawing attention to boundaries, usually from the perspective of blurring the boundaries, or blurring the boundaries between nature and society, or interrogating the boundaries that are drawn between nature and society, as well as sort of focusing on the boundaries, the material boundaries that are drawn on the ground with what kinds of socio-economic, political, and sometimes ecological consequences, right? Particularly around places that we assume as natural environments. These are a picture from Ngorongoro Conservation Area, where some of you might know the Maasai originally lived inside, and then they were removed with all kinds of ecological impacts on the environment, let alone on the Maasai community itself. And now tourists are allowed inside, but yet it still gets sort of discussed as a particular kind of natural environment, right? But I'm also kind of moving slightly away from the focus within political ecology, again, to kind of focus on the border crossings itself, right? As opposed to just sort of blurring the boundaries, to kind of suggesting that a focus on the boundaries themselves can raise new questions and highlight interesting processes as well. And sort of in terms of looking at what and how things, processes, people's ideas cross these boundaries, right? So in other words, I'm sort of suggesting that it's all, it's at the borderlands where it's all happening, right? But that's a sort of interesting place to be. And I don't mean here, I'm going to sort of make a slight political statement, but I don't mean here, of course, the boundary, the wall that's being built between the border between Mexico and the United States as we speak. And, you know, to be honest, you know, in the particular climate that we're in right now, the political climate, I'm sort of both hesitant to talk about borders and boundary drawing, but I also think it's that much more important because we all recognize that boundaries and actual discrete borders aren't going anywhere anytime soon. In fact, they're being reestablished and in many, many ways, right? In ways that are often defining, just, you know, making these big differences between us and them. And sometimes it's between a national boundary like the United States and Mexico, and sometimes it's between different groups of people, right? And sometimes it's just between different ways of thinking. In the United States, you know, there's many, many ways in which these boundaries are being drawn right now, right? Between urban and rural, educated and uneducated, and even these sort of distinctions themselves sort of being a part of the process of boundary drawing. And for those of you, you know, for this particular moment right now, between what we think of natural science and social science, between, in my own work, I look at the boundary between what we think of as science and indigenous knowledge or other ways of knowing. And no matter what, they're always sort of making a distinction between us and them, right? And so I think that more than ever, we need to focus on that process because we can't start to talk about taking walls down or blurring boundaries or even building dialogues across them if we don't first understand how boundaries themselves are drawn, deflected, ignored, reworked, and maintained in various ways. And also I want to suggest that a focus on borders, again, highlights that we're always seeing from and speaking from somewhere, right? That there is something that's dividing us that we want to cross, and that means that it's a focus on our particular positionality as well. So just a little bit of a self-plug here. I am, of course, you know, sort of drawing from my work sort of across time. I'm not going to focus on one particular article. I'm going to kind of draw across. And some of the work on sort of the need to cross borders was highlighted in the book that I co-edited with Matt Turner and Paul Nadashis at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And all your graduate students should know I did this as a graduate student, you know, and so that was a really exciting opportunity and definitely pushed me on the path that I am still on today. And we were interested in particular at sort of looking at that, what we saw as the boundary area between political ecology and science studies, or STS, science and technology studies. And it really was an interest in that border area, like what's going on, you know, where they're not meeting, and why are they not meeting? What can we take from, how can we sort of make that sort of gray zone in the middle more exciting? How can we bring things together a little bit more? And so I am going to draw on that a little bit, but I'm also moving in new directions, drawing more from what is being referred to as post-colonial STS now. I think that's on here as well, right? It's in that border zone. Post-colonial STS overlaps quite a lot with political ecology, but they're also drawing on sort of what's being called more generally within the social sciences, the ontological turn. And so there's some of that was in here, not necessarily with that language, because it wasn't yet really hip, right? But I was focused much earlier on epistemological differences, and I want to say that right now, particularly if we're going to be talking about this border crossing, it's not just about epistemology, it's also about ontology. We're talking about borders creating new kinds of realities and different kinds of realities for different groups of people and individuals, right? So it's not just about knowing, different ways of knowing one reality, which is epistemology, but it's also about different ways of being in the world and the very existence of different worlds. So this notion of multiple ontologies. I'm not going to use too much of that language, but that's sort of an underlying thread throughout, and I'm happy to talk about it in the question and answer. And so the idea here, though, is that to really interrogate the borderlands, right? And again, sort of using that as a metaphor, and I might just overuse it, but we really need to first understand that the borderlands themselves are different things to different groups of people, and that they also create different kinds of realities. And then I'm also drawing from feminist scholarship. And so that is not actually on here. It's a huge gap. But within political ecology, within science and technology studies, to just think critically about how we talk about and how we actually cross borders. I'm also drawing from, I've been particularly inspired lately from the work of Richa Nagar. And any of you doing any kind of social science work, I highly recommend that you read Muddying the Waters. It's a brilliant book that she just came out with. And it sort of talks about the necessity of crossing borders between the global north and the global south, between academia and advocacy. She's not focused on conservation, but it doesn't really matter. But also on the dangers of doing so, right? And recognizing that it's never an innocent process. You know, it's a process that's drenched in uneven power dynamics, uneven political economies, and of course, you know, sort of imperialist history, right? But that also makes the process that much more important. And then I also draw from feminist science and technology studies scholars, such as Donna Haraway and Karen Barad, who also warn about sort of boundary drawing, particularly between nature and society, but also sort of help us to think about the process a little bit more deeply in terms of understanding that that's not good.
I'm trying to look up that book.
Well, I'm glad that, you know, that was impactful. But to recognize, of course, again, the situated nature, right, of boundaries, sort of where they are and how we know them shift with the viewer, the knower, the crosser, the reinforcer, right? All of that actually matters. And to also recognize, and this is a really important part, particularly for this integrative aspect of the program, is that boundaries come into being through social relations, right? And so we're not talking about sort of predefined boundaries, whether it's between nature and society, or whether it's between particular disciplines, but it's rather that we can kind of look at conservation outcomes, we can look at conservation boundaries as coming into being, as being constructed, as being performed, as being enacted, choose whichever. And I know like the ecologists might be like, this is all this jargon that gets thrown around within the social sciences, but I think they're all important terms. That the reason why there's so many of them, it's about trying to understand the process is important, right? And how we name it matters. But recognizing that they're coming into being through relations, right? And so we can think about borders between nature and society, for instance, come into being, sort of certain conservation borders come into being through the act of placing the border and what kind of impacts that has. And then that creates certain kinds of relationships between communities and conservation agencies. It changes the relationship on the ground between communities and what they had previously been interacting with. And it creates sort of border communities, threatened animal species, migratory animal species. All these things that we often talk about as given categories are in fact created through the process of boundary drawing. Right. Okay, so jump forward, whoops. Okay. So just to reiterate, this means that paying attention to the borders actually matters, right? And so to illustrate this, sort of, I'm going to go through some of the work that I've done in Tanzania and Kenya, right? And I'm going to start off with just a brief description of these landscapes and some photographs that highlight how, you know, this notion that we can actually draw boundaries between what's considered natural and what's considered social. It doesn't really work in particular places. And then I'm going to read from the early part of the book that I'm putting together, which is from my dissertation. So again, for you graduate students, sometimes it takes 10 plus years to turn your dissertation into a book. But that's going to be sort of the end of the reading part. But so just to kind of introduce you, I know that many of you are already familiar with this part of the world. But this is a map that shows where on the continent of Africa, I'm working in the savanna landscape. And then these sort of, whoops, oh, maybe it is working, no? Is it just set on like auto? Hopefully not. All right, so the boxes represent, so here's this is East Africa. Most of my work has been in Tanzania, although I have done some work in Kenya as well. And all of it is with Maasai pastoral, or agro-pastoral, some people like to say now, groups in sort of these conservation landscapes. So people, communities that live outside of, adjacent to, sometimes inside of conservation landscapes. And so the one that I've done the most on is Simanjiro, and that's what I'm going to focus mostly on. But I'll also draw some photographs from the Amboseli ecosystem. Kitengela is the area that's right outside Nairobi National Park. And then there's me, the Masai Mara Game Reserve. I thought there was, okay, there we go. And so these are the sort of the other boxes, right? And this just represents, one of them is actually inside Tanzania. This represents the Tanzanian side of the landscape, the Serengeti landscape, which is mostly the Loliondo area, and some of you might have heard about that in terms of sort of very politicized places where boundaries are actually causing all kinds of problems within Maasai communities, okay? And now just to give you some photographs of, to highlight, the work that boundaries are not doing in these particular landscapes. And this is a photo, it's a really bad image, but it's a great image for illustration. I use it all the time in my undergrad classes. So the outline, the dark black outline is actually Tarangire National Park. And this is literally just a page from the reconnaissance surveys that the Tanzanian Wildlife, the Tanzanian Wildlife Research Institute does, right, to count animals. And all these circles, the bigger they are, the more animals they are. And these are wildlife counts, right? Just literally a plane flying over to count wildlife. And you can see, so this is Tarangire National Park over here. This is a game reserve on the outside of it. And then this large number of animals over here is inside a small strip of a park called Lake Manyara National Park. A lot of my work has been in the middle here. And you can see in the dry season, all of the animals, most of the animals are inside the parks. And this is sort of a relic of how the boundaries were created to begin with, which is started off as hunting reserves. Almost all the national parks, the early ones that were established during colonialism in East Africa, began as hunting reserves. And the best way to hunt animals is to get there in the dry season when you can drive and get to the places. Many of these areas are totally inaccessible in the rainy season. And then you're going to have large conglomerations of animals over the only permanent water source in the area, which is the Tarangire River in here. So there they are. This is the wet season. No animals inside the park at all, right? Because it's not the most nutritious grass, and this is something that I said I'm not really going to talk too much about the ecology here, but one of the important components is that this is a semi-arid landscape, and so there's a great deal of fluctuation in terms of quantity and quality of pasture over the year, and then across seasons and across space. And so usually the high quality grass is in areas that does not have permanent water sources. And so that's in the Simanjiro plains. And so it's sort of ephemeral water sources, and when it rains, there's an influx of wildlife, right? And they leave the sort of coarse grass that's inside the park. And then there's also otherwise in the middle of the area. And so just to show you some pictures of what this looks like, oh wait, there's a couple more maps first. I'm going to show you all the maps because the next couple maps I'm going to show are sort of conservation agency attempts to understand what's going on and why can't they just why are the boundaries not doing work, and what kind of boundaries could we build, what sort of to keep those animals in, sort of what new work needs to be done. So this is one of the earliest ones that was done that sort of recognized that animals are leaving, and this was a way of mapping all the migratory routes. And I've written about this in terms of how those migratory routes began just as research about animals moving, and they turned into discussions of conservation corridors. But again, you can see that all of a sudden we've got migratory animals because the border is not keeping them in, right? And then discussion of the importance of this area out here. And then conservation agencies coming in and trying to do more elaborate work of tracking where animals go, and so using radio collars, GPS units, all kinds of techniques to actually map, and again draw different boundaries. So sort of these kernel densities to kind of better understand where, again, new border or new boundaries can be drawn around what are considered important animal wildlife habitat. So what do these places look like? This is east of Tarangire National Park in the Simanjiro Plains, and you can see wildlife are grazing on pasture. I use this again in my undergraduate classes to say, what are we looking at, right? Is this natural or social? It's not inside the national park. It's village land. Okay, it's utilized as well by Maasai for grazing. They avoid the area when wildebeest are there and when wildebeest are calving, because wildebeest spread a deadly disease at that time period to cattle, right? And so the politics are very different there than they are in the United States, right? In the United States, bison cross the border and they get shot because they might infect our cattle, which are really of high economic value. In Tanzania, wildebeest will spread the disease. It is deadly, but Maasai don't have the power to sort of keep the wildebeest off the land. They need to migrate. And this is west of Tarangire National Park. So this is the area where I did my dissertation work, where I lived for 2 years. And this is inside village land again, zebra sort of commingling with cattle calves. This is on the outside of Maasai Mara Game Reserve in Kenya. And there, just as an aside, and I'll talk a little bit about it if I have time at the end, again, Maasai Mara Game Reserve is very similar in the sense of, in the wet season, all the animals leave the park. And I've been there at times when there's literally no animals inside. And you leave, and then you see the giraffes, and you also see all the tourism vehicles. And so with the recognition of that, there's been a sort of a skyrocketing of the creation of new conservation areas outside of Maasai Mara Game Reserve. And again, unfortunately, rather than sort of recognizing that this happens and sort of understanding how we have the creation of new kinds of boundaries, the first thing that happens when a new conservation, they're called conservancies. When a new conservancy is established, is usually creating a place that is just for wildlife. This is outside Nairobi National Park, which might soon disappear as they're putting a railroad through Nairobi National Park. But you've got cattle co-grazing with zebra. And this is another picture that will really sort of make your, throw your mind in terms of what we think of when we think of where wildlife are, right, in East Africa. This is, in fact, an image that you can see. Not only do you have, actually, I don't think there are cattle here. I think those are, no, they do look like some cattle. It looks like some topi in the background. Zebra again. Zebra are kind of ubiquitous. And then, of course, the city and the mushrooming sort of semi-urban development going on. But there is, of course, boundary crossing in the other direction. It's harder to get pictures. It's illegal. This is one where I went herding with the herder inside the Manyara Ranch. It was early on, and there wasn't as much serious policing going on as there started to be towards the end. And that's changed again, too. But there's also constant use of pastures within Maasai Mara Game Reserve. Bilal Butt has written quite a lot about that. He actually just was so trusted by the communities that they let him put GPS collars on cattle so that he could track how they move inside the park. They are in fact beaten up, and when they are caught inside the Mara Game Reserve, in Tarangire National Park, they go in quite often and they pay heavy fines. Right? Their ability to crisscross into the parks is starting to change, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But what I want to do right now is to read a little bit. Oops. Can you guys hear me? Okay. The scarf is kind of falling down. But what I want to do, I want to read a little bit from, like I said, I'm sort of writing my book now, and I have sort of the introduction. It's kind of a vignette of sorts. And the idea is to really sort of bring forth how difficult it is to even understand these landscapes. And so this is the beginning of what I'm hoping for the introduction, so any feedback later on would be really appreciated. Okay. Though it was not yet noon, the hot sun beat down on us relentlessly as we walked home from the morning's work counting animals down by Lake Manyara. I was with two Maasai young men, my regular research assistant Molel and Lizer, who had joined us for the day. We were walking through the short grass plains in an area called Angato Lawaru, which is this, in the Maasai language, or Ma, which means the plains of the lion or the plains of the predator. While the area was not frequented by lions, as perhaps it had been in the past, it was certainly full of zebra and gazelle that morning. The shortgrass plains were so named because it attracts zebra, wildebeest, gazelles, which then in turn attract lions. It is also a favorite grazing area for cattle, yet there were few cattle here that day, or today, as it was a hot, dry day, and cattle had been brought into the neighboring Manyara Ranch to graze, where there was water and tall grass. They had been brought in to graze illegally, for the Manyara Ranch had recently become a conservation area, and livestock grazing was allowed only on a limited basis. Yet for resident Maasai in this village, the Manyara Ranch was an important grazing area. So despite its recent conservation status, they continued to graze as they could, wherever they could, behind the rules that many of them were actually involved in creating. One of my assistants walking with me that day, Molel, commented that if the village had actually if they were actually managing the Manyara Ranch and wildlife were bringing in benefits that they could see, then they would regulate grazing in the ranch better. And they would even think about giving up their farms, because the conservation area, and the benefits would be theirs. They would own it. Lizer, who was also with us that day, had worked in the tourist industry for a hunting company locally and then as a guard in a hotel in Zanzibar, and he was much more cynical. As he explained, What I see, and I don't know if you do or if others do, is this. Maasai and wildlife bring in the largest percentage of tourist money to our country. Tourists come here and they want to see Maasai. People make carvings of animals and of Maasai. They make carvings that look just like you, and they sell them, and we get nothing, nothing at all. He paused and then continued. If you see animals, Maasai are not far. If you see cattle, animals, meaning wildlife, are not far. Looking in my direction, he said, why? Before I could ask, knowing that I would. Because they are both things of the wild, Pori. He said simply. But was it really that simple? In trying to understand the complex ways that Maasai feel about and interact with wildlife, I made a point when I first went to the field of not talking about wildlife. I did not want Maasai to think that I was a, quote, wildlife researcher, like the many others in the area, which would have biased their discussions with me. And this is, of course, one of those boundaries that are drawn, and I was very aware of that boundary and did not want to be placed into it. So I was very cautious and actually didn't do any official interviews for 6 months and never specifically asked them about wildlife, which of course caused all kinds of, they sort of were very confused about what I was doing. I wanted them to feel free and comfortable talking to me about anything, including wildlife, and so they did. They would talk with awe about the mass birthing of the wildebeest. If only I could see it, they would insist. On trips to national parks, they would remark on the skill and agility of impala, observe with great affection the way mother baboons carry their young, and exclaim with anger and excitement that if only they had their spears when we saw a lion. At home, they would also show me the poison arrows that they used to shoot animals that entered their farms. And they would tell me when the Ilmaran, and so the Ilmaran are the warrior age set, sort of the youth anywhere from about 14 to 35. When the Ilmaran were going on a lion hunt. Maasai feelings about wildlife, I quickly learned, were multiple, complex, and changing. They were also closely associated with their feelings about conservation. They would simultaneously insist that they were the original conservators of wildlife, and then talk about wildlife conservation as occurring over there, inside the parks and inside the Manyara Ranch. They spoke with pride about their decision to have the Manyara Ranch be a community conservation area, where wildlife and livestock would share the pastures as they always have, and they, as a village, would benefit from conservation tourism. Yet they respected the Manyara Ranch boundary by farming up to it, making sure that it did not shift and that conservation did not move into their land. One of the men whose farm was up against the boundary was a game scout for the ranch and a good friend, Tipulate. And this is actually a picture of Tipulate. All of the names that I use are actually pseudonyms, except for this one because he gave me permission and he recently passed away a couple years ago, unexpectedly. So sort of in honor of him. When I visited Tipulate on the ranch, he proudly showed me around, talking about all the wildlife, especially the pride of wild dogs that had recently set up home there. There were no wild dogs left in Serengeti, he exclaimed, but they were here, and that was something to be proud of. He showed me his GPS unit and all the recordings he had made of various animals. And when we spoke a bit about wildlife, then we spoke a bit about wildlife and cattle co-use of the ranch. As we passed a herd of ranch cattle. And so the ranch was, just a little bit of background, the ranch, it was a land that belonged to this village, or the 2 villages that border it, 2 out of the 4 that border it. And they gave it away to a herder, a white herder that asked for access to the ranch during colonialism. So they weren't basically, this is some of you that have worked in Maasai areas recognize that historically there wasn't a recognition of the ability to draw a boundary, a hard boundary on land and have exclusive ownership. So they gave him use rights to it, which of course turned into exclusive ownership rights. With independence, it became a state-run cattle ranch. And then through the liberalization moment, it went up for sale, at which point, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, it became a conservation area. So at this point in time, it was fairly new. There were still cattle ranch on the ranch. There was plenty of grass on the ranch, he suggested, but AWF, which was the African Wildlife Foundation, they're the ones that were running the ranch. They just want the place to be for conservation, and they think that the cattle will ruin the area. They only want wildlife, and so they were thinking of getting rid of the ranch cattle. And this, of course, reinforces this boundary that in order for it to be a wild area, you need to get rid of the ranch cattle. It was a highly political issue, and it never went through. And so there were still, till the end, ranch cattle on it. And then in the dry season, villagers were able to request permission to enter the ranch with some of their cattle. They're going to build hotels, he said excitedly. Back in the village, I moved into an old house of his in the boma where his mother lived. I was surprised to find poison arrows hidden away in the thatched roof. Then one day I had a conversation with his best friend and age mate, Mpake. I simply asked Mpake if his farm was on the border of the ranch. Yes, he said, it's right on the border. But he didn't stop there. And this is actually a picture of cattle and right on the border. And I'm not quite, they're probably inside the ranch. There's no designated border, you can't see it. It is my land, he said. He continued to explain that it was not like it was in Ngorongoro, the Ngorongoro Conservation Area. It was not an area where people could stop him from farming. He seemed quite defensive about this when all I had said was, is your farm on the border? But he also spoke in a self-assured and proud way, like he knew what his rights were and he was not going to compromise them. He was luckier than those Maasai in Ngorongoro because he did have these rights. He insisted that the Maasai in Ngorongoro were poor because of all the restrictions placed on them by conservation, including the restriction on farming. The problem in Ngorongoro, he said, was that the entire area is hifadhi, conservation. But isn't this area also conservation? I asked. No, he said defensively. This is our village, and we can farm the whole area if we want to. No one can stop us. Manyara is over there, he said, pointing to the ranch off in the distance. He informed me that his farm used to extend into the ranch, but he was told that he had to move it to respect the ranch boundary. He was told to move the farm by a Manyara Ranch game scout, his friend, brother, and business partner, Tipalit. But Tipalit also had a farm on the border, right next to Mpake's farm. Being so close to the ranch, both farms suffered from high crop rating. When I asked if animals came to his farm, Mpake responded by snapping his fingers up in front of his face, a Maasai gesture of exaggeration. He said, too many animals. They all come to the farm. Buffalo, elephant, gazelle, all of them. And then he exclaimed, quite matter-of-factly, how he would shoot these animals with poison arrows, but oh, if he had a gun. There was a Swahili woman hired for the purpose of guarding the farm. Then what about Tipalit? I asked. I was assured that he too would kill the animals that entered his farm. So I just openly asked, Tipalit cares about wildlife inside the conservation area, the Manyara Ranch, but outside he doesn't care? That's right, he said. Then he explained with a slight smile on his face how Tipalit worked for Manyara Ranch. He worked for the government and their animals. It was a job. Outside the ranch boundary was another story. It was his farm, his personal business, which was about his and his own family's survival. It was that simple. But it was not, and it is not that simple. Both Mpake and Tipalit were also intrigued by and extremely knowledgeable about wildlife. Mpake constantly requested that I take him to national parks and always dreamed of seeing Serengeti. While I was in the field, he had the opportunity to go with a tour company that was working in his village. And he was thrilled to see so many animals, including ones that were different than the ones he had at home. He sometimes helped me out with transect work, and he was always interested in and informative about wildlife we saw in the village, but far from his farm. And it's important to know as well that wildlife often came to their boma at night to avoid lions that were, as wildlife numbers went up inside the Manyara Ranch, more and more lions came into the ranch, and so wildebeest would often escape the ranch at night and sleep right outside the boma. But wildebeest don't raid farms, so they don't really care. Both men had been involved at different times with different wildlife-related research projects, and both had been actively engaged in keeping Ilmaround back from killing lions inside Manyara Ranch and inside the village. And so they were both sort of heavily engaged with wildlife, heavily sort of interested in it, right? And so it wasn't that their sort of desire for wildlife, or their appreciation for wildlife only happened inside the Manyara Ranch. It was also inside village spaces and other spaces. And also, a lot had happened and a lot had changed since 2002 when I had that conversation. A new wildlife-based tourism project started inside village land, which meant that it became beneficial to have wildlife and to know where wildlife were in village spaces because they were actually getting money for that. And these two individuals as well had spent a lot of time working with me, working with other researchers that were coming into the area, and had begun to recognize or to sort of be made aware of from the outside that their knowledge regarding wildlife was valuable, right? It sort of had value outside of their own use of it. And so they started to have more confidence in that knowledge and the ability to use that knowledge together with others to challenge conservation-related projects which didn't necessarily make sense, which attempted to draw more boundaries, particularly in their land. And so it wasn't, again, so simple as this is my land, I can control it and I can farm on it. It started to sort of incorporate knowledge about ecology, knowledge about wildlife that was able to challenge on ecological as well as political and human rights grounds new boundary drawings in these spaces, right? And so they challenged AWF, they're currently challenging the Nature Conservancy in terms of entering and doing any kind of new conservation work in their lands. And so, and these, I would argue, in sort of to bring it back to the ontological question, are actually ontological questions. It's not just about what they know, but them and others have are sort of doing this at other places in some of the other landscapes that I pointed to, particularly in the Lolionda landscapes. Maasai standing up and saying, this is nature conservation. Tourists are coming here. They want to see Maasai. They want to see wildlife, and Maasai and wildlife live together. And we don't need to draw new boundaries for new kinds of conservation. And so it's not just a political argument, but it's also an ontological argument in terms of saying that our landscape is about wildlife, is about livestock, is about farms, is about people, right? And so what I'm interested in the book, in this presentation, in all of my work, is to better understand, or to see how we can better understand and potentially promote that sort of reality, right? What does it mean? And part of the purpose of reading that long excerpt was to say, I'm talking about Maasai. It's really easy to jump to one extreme and say, well, there's this living in harmony with nature, or they're destroyers of nature, right? And I think it's really important to realize that there's this constant, sort of border crossing going on all the time by individuals, by communities, sometimes explicit, sometimes implicit, sometimes very sort of much planned, sometimes just a part of getting on, right? And that we need to understand that complexity before we have any sorts of conversations about what to do at the borderlands. And what I want to argue is that community-based conservation in this area, but I would say pretty much everywhere, is really not about, and hasn't ever really been about, understanding that complexity. It's almost always about reinforcing borders, making sure relations work across those borders, but reinforcing them or drawing new ones, right? And so there's lots of different ways in which community-based conservation unfolds. This is an example, this is a picture from Simanjiro Ranch, a meeting that was going on there, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this area, but I mostly want to sort of just touch on the different aspects of that community-based conservation unfolds, the different sort of aspects of it, and the ways in which boundaries get reinforced through these different processes, right? And so most of you are familiar with these different aspects of community-based conservation, right? These are getting highlighted because they're the parts that we would like to think are not really about community conservation, but their increased use as of late highlight that, in fact, it's just yet another really sort of politicized and militarized reinforcing of boundaries. But I'm going to start with the top and just kind of go through a few examples. The first one is awareness raising, right? That's, this was part of what intrigued me and got me started with my research to begin with, is that almost all community interventions begin with, let's teach people how to care about the environment, rather than asking what they already do and how we can learn from that. And one of the most obvious examples that continues to happen throughout Maasai areas is with lion hunting. And I've written about this, I'm not going to talk about it too much, but sort of the men of the Ilmoran age set, which shows this guy standing up with his spear, and the guy's over there, he's got a headdress with lion mane on it. They're responsible for hunting lions, right? And there's been a massive misinterpretation of Maasai relationship with lions. The idea is they hunt them, they must therefore hate them. And so I've worked with Joanna Roque-Pino, who's done work in Kenya. This is her, and this is after a lion hunt, to understand the complex reasons why, in fact, Maasai hunt lions, right? To start off with, what do Maasai think about lions? How do Maasai feel about lions? How does that play out in their relationship with lions, right? And so how does this fit into my boundary sort of analogy or metaphor? Is that the notion is that there's the Western way of thinking about conservation that needs to be imparted on people that are outside that. And that in order to understand how others think about conservation or wildlife, we need to kind of place it into Western categories, right? And they're usually categories of economic value, right? And so the idea is they kill lions because lions kill their livestock. We can reimburse them financially, and then that'll solve the problem. Or culture. And it's just so culturally archaic that we can't really understand it, so let's just change it. As opposed to sort of recognizing that there are often ecological reasons. Maasai have a very high respect for lions. And again, I'm not going to go into great detail, but they respect lions, and there's a lot of space to sort of use that respect and sort of to work forward in terms of lion conservation policies that would draw on their knowledge, as opposed to just asking them to participate. What's happening right now is some of the more participatory projects are having Ilmaron join on as lion guardians. And so they're saying, rather than hunt lions, help us to protect lions. And they say they're drawing on sort of traditional notions of their responsibilities, which is true, but it's sort of bypassing the question of what lions are and how people can sort of contribute that understanding to the process. And so I've been quite critical of that particular participatory process, right? The notion that they need to be taught how to better herd, how to build better bomas, instead of asking, well, why don't you have any, why is your boma not enclosed? Well, because there's no access to resources to enclose it. Why do you have a child herding? Well, because the elder ones are going to school. So there's very little sort of interrogation of many of the reasons why things are happening instead of just we're going to teach you. Participatory planning. This is where we think it's all sort of really good and happening. And of course, I've critiqued this too. But it's about, well, so okay, people are going to be brought on. We're going to have a participatory process, but who's going to be brought in? So this is one woman. There were 3 women out of 10 members of the steering committee. They were all sort of handpicked by men. The men were all village leaders. Who participates? At what point do they participate? On whose schedule? According to kind of what sort of social norms, right? And that, again, this is a recognition that like we are talking about different ways of doing things, different ways of communicating, and that these questions matter. It doesn't just matter. You can't just have participatory processes without asking those sets of questions, right? Moving beyond participation, there's a lot of discussion today about co-managing and co-production of knowledge. The co-production is explosion for me just is like, it's basically participation, I don't know how many years later, it's the same set of arguments, the same sort of set of ideas. And I guess, again, it's this idea that we're going to co-produce knowledge, so let's give some Maasai GPS units and have them go out and track animals, as opposed to sort of understanding, again, that there are different ways of understanding and tracking animals, and how can we bring those together into dialogue? Are we just sort of giving tools that oftentimes this notion of co-production in particular sort of collapses differences, because the idea is that we're all going to sit around a table together and contribute. And so it collapses a focus on difference. When we talk about, I'm not talking about difference in the sense of exclusion, but you need to, again, recognize that differences exist to have a real fruitful conversation. And this has become a really big focus of mine, and right here I just call it the communication challenge. Someone mentioned, that there would be sort of an interest in hearing how I've gotten to look at certain things. Well, I was, in the field and observing these new meetings that were going on in the Manyara Ranch, but I was also observing other kinds of meetings of all kinds. So I observed Maasai meetings themselves, that were about age set matters, about different sort of community matters, and then I observed meetings of outsiders coming in, and I watched the same things happen over and over again, which was outside groups. And when I say outside, even Maasai groups themselves, Maasai NGOs coming from the city, they would hold a meeting in a sort of contemporary Western style. And it was radically different from the way that Maasai communicate and have their own meetings. And so it immediately shut down any kind of participation whatsoever, because the actual format of discussion was different, right? So just as an example, Maasai open up a meeting as a sort of a general, this is the problem, or this is the question. There is no agenda, because once the agenda is open-ended, once sort of a conclusion is stated, like we think we should start a new project of planting trees in this area, we want some feedback. If that sort of idea is put forth by an elder, by somebody that's respected, then it's kind of shut down any conversation whatsoever. And so I started to get really interested in understanding the different forms of communication and how a focus on that can help us to actually really build dialogues when there's a real desire to do so. Granted, there's not always a real desire, right? But I was lucky enough to sort of also be working with groups of people that were interested, that really did have a desire, and yet we're still having massive failures all the time. And after the meeting, they would say to me, I wanted them to participate. Why didn't anybody say anything? And then I would have to say, well, because you sat at the front and they were all over here, because you had an agenda, because you said, I think we should do that, because of all these reasons, right? Of course, that's not the only reason, the only sort of aspect. There's some highly political reasons why people don't participate, but it's one really important component. And then this is a saying that I think in some ways encapsulates this by an elder who, after a meeting, says to me, you see a bird that has no hands, only a beak, and it builds a house that you don't know how to build, right? How do you, like, that needs to be appreciated. Like, people from here know things, but they don't always know how to tell you in the way that you're asking. Okay. So how did I go about doing that? Well, and I was actually going to go through some of the different examples of conservation areas, but it looks like I'm kind of running out of time.
15 minutes.
Oh, I have 15 minutes left. Oh, then I do have time. Okay. So so what I want to do is just kind of highlight a little bit more about the Manure Ranch and then just show two examples really quickly that are slightly successful so that I'm not completely being negative here. And through that, sort of talk about what I've been doing on this. And so the Manure Ranch, I've already talked quite a bit about it, but just so that you can really see it here. So you can see very distinctly that it's like this boundary. It was a ranch. These are the two villages that I talked about, sort of having claim to it, right? And you can see it's in between the two parks. And so that's where all the discussion of protecting an important wildlife corridor comes in. But it's really all about boundary making, right? So AWF sort of worked a lot to fortify the boundary. And then they tried to create a new wildlife corridor project through the area. They focused on things that happen inside the park as inside the area that can benefit communities and so forth. But the management structure itself also reinforced boundaries of knowledge and management. So it reinforced a hierarchy that it was actually run by the Tanzanian Land Conservation Trust, which had a board of directors, which was experts. TANAPA is the Tanzanian National Parks Association, private tour operators, WWF, and then one community representative who was the richest man in the area and also a well-respected Laibon, or spiritual healer, and the former member of parliament for this area, right, who also was the prime minister of Tanzania and recently ran for president. And it should be known that the Laibon didn't speak any Swahili. Okay, and so the national language is Swahili, the meetings were all in Swahili. So he was literally just like a icon of the community that had no power. He had power in the communities. And then the steering committee, which were representatives from the village, right? And through a long discussion of sort of really understanding their job, they realized that they were not in a steering committee because the steering committee should be able to steer. They were an advisory committee. So here we have sort of a reproduction of the boundaries of hierarchical knowledge and power, right? This map is one of the ways that I tried to kind of, this is sort of me doing, part of my research was mapping on the way in which Maasai knew and understood the area. And so this is a map of Maasai place names. The challenges, Western conceptions of space. You can see that, I don't know if it's that clear from this map, but there's spaces in between. When I had a cartographer help me with this, he's like, well, I was like, just draw the shapes. He's like, but what do I do with the spaces in between? I'm like, just leave them open, right? Because this is how they conceptualized and used their space. And you'll see that some of the village spaces actually goes inside the ranch. We also talked about doing the ranch itself, but we never finalized it. But using Maasai place names helped us to talk about land use as well. And putting a map like this and using a map like this to sort of talk about map and construct sort of planning processes empowers a different, as sort of a turning on the tables in terms of whose knowledge gets priority in terms of understanding the particular ecosystem. The red dots are homesteads. And then these are different grazing areas and so forth. The other thing that Manure Ranch did was heavily police their borders. There weren't any boundaries drawn on the ground, although there's been a lot of ongoing work about putting beacons in, challenging beacons, having outside agencies come to map the areas, having some of those agencies kicked out. I literally had somebody whispering to me in an office because they wanted to use my map because there was so much fear because of the politics involved at the time. This is a picture from the 2009 drought when Maasai from all over Tanzania, Kenya, came to access grazing land according to Maasai social norms. You can never turn away a hungry herder, never. Hungry being in the sense of a needy herder that needs pasture and water. And so movement happened on a scale that it had never happened before. People from all over Tanzania and Kenya, many came here because they knew about the ranch. As more and more Maasai came in, and their fellow Maasai couldn't keep them out, Manure Ranch called in tour companies, local officials, got more and more cars, and then eventually had to threaten local villagers that if they did not kick out herders, that they too would be thrown in jail. And they confiscated cattle. And so within the community, people started to say, we have no reason to respect Manure Ranch anymore. Manure Ranch does not respect us. And so they started completely disregarding the boundary even more than they had before. Increased illegal grazing, increased burning, and hunting lions inside the park. Similarly, just before this time, there was a huge disagreement between lion hunting because officially in Tanzania, only if you have a permit and you're an outsider can you hunt a lion. You pay a lot of money. But there's also recognition that if cattle are killed, that you can kill the lion. But not inside a conservation area, that becomes a lot more difficult. And so when Maasai felt like it was legitimately their right to kill a lion and they were stopped by the conservation area authority, they fought back. And so they started to kill lions in higher numbers and make statements that they would kill lions within the Manure Ranch as well. And now within this area, one of the organizations that's taken over the Manure Ranch, there's a push for the use of drones. And I'm not going to talk too much about this today because it's an entire new area. I'm doing some new research on this, on the ways in which drones, so these are conservation drones. Some of them are used for research to track where animals are going. There's an argument that they can help human-wildlife conflict by scaring elephants away, although most ecologists say that will only work until the elephants learn about the drone and then they won't be scared anymore. But more importantly for policing. So a lot of that illegal grazing that I talked about, it happens everywhere, and people have sort of established really elaborate social networks to do it. Oftentimes it's people who have money, they'll go into the park with $90 in their pocket and pay for their use of the park. But now if you've got drones seeing from above, the notion is that the borders are recognized from maps. Certain borders matter than others. There's border conflicts everywhere, but it's this sort of reification of borders as recognized from a scientific perspective in real time, and then being able to translate that data down to people on the ground. This was supposed to come in afterwards, but you can see down here it's basically they're sending it to a command center, the anti-poaching unit's coming out, and then there's usually men with guns and dogs. So what this is leading to is a reification of the boundaries between conservation and people. So this was actually stated prior to the use of drones, but by a friend of mine about a new conservation area. Said, I don't hate wildlife and not want them here, nor do I like tourists, nor do I like them for tourists because we don't see them, the tourists. Wildlife on the side of tourists are not the problem, though. It is the people who protect the wildlife that are the problem. And so how did I address this? One of the ways was, like I showed you in that map, sort of highlighting particular individual notions of individual ways of seeing and knowing the landscape, but I also collected ecological data. I wanted to show that wildlife were in village spaces, that these boundaries didn't necessarily work, and if you really wanted to protect wildlife, you should be concerned about what's going on in the village. But there's always political ramifications there as well. We purposely didn't put transects in places that were just way too important for people, and if this data got into the wrong hands, and if that land was taken away because it was so valuable for wildlife, then that would be really damaging. I did participate in observation of herding, of meetings inside and outside of the Manure Ranch, that's supposed to say. So basically all my work was about interrogating these borders, right? Between the park, between what's considered conservation and what's considered human space, between what's different ways of knowing that space. And then had a lot of interviews as well. And in the end, I talked to people about what they would do if they ran the Manure Ranch. And many of the statements themselves were quite illustrative of how they did not necessarily see boundaries, right? It's a place for wildlife and cattle, livestock grazing in the dry season only, as an alaluli, which is a reserved pasture. So it should be noted that during the 2009 drought, all the reserved pasture areas that Maasai had set aside, this is one of the customary forms of rangeland management, they have a pasture area set aside that only small and sick livestock can use. Those were all completely enforced and still had standing grass towards the end of the drought. Right, the only places in all of Maasai areas. Whereas the ranch was not considered theirs, and so it was sort of anybody can use it. We, the elders, can do it better than the government can. We can set up such a grazing arrangement that the village will basically be able to use it properly. So again, this understanding that they can manage it if they're in fact in control of it. I also, and this is just to kind of give you some, from a research perspective, so I did use GIS maps. I don't do any of this anymore, actually, but at the time, it seemed really important to basically show where the wildlife were and to use different ways of showing how wildlife were in fact in village lands. Again, sort of multiple ways of speaking. So that communication challenge, multiple ways of communicating knowledge. And so we actually got some funding for 2 years after I left to have Maasai continue to do the livestock, the transects in village land. And they would argue to me that, they knew where wildlife were, and their knowledge is valuable in different kinds of ways, but they also knew that this was the kind of information that people listened to, and so they wanted to have that information so that they could have that as as a tool in their toolkit. But just a quick example of other places where I think things are being done differently because the boundary work is being done differently. And so the Simanjiro Conservation Easement is an area to the east of Tarangire National Park. So that area that I showed a slide of before with all the wildlife where it's an incredibly important area for wildlife and for livestock, and just sort of a growing sense of fear and anxiety among Maasai as well as conservationists that it was being threatened. It was disappearing to farms. And many of the farms were coming in as a form of political statements to lay claim to the land so that wildlife wouldn't take it. But at the same time, there was a growing fear among Maasai themselves that they were losing access to grazing land. And so a huge sort of collaborative agreement was formed that included Maasai tour operators that work in the area but do not have any kind of hotel in this particular area. But their livelihood depends on wildlife being alive, which the wildlife need that area, right? And the Wildlife Conservation Society. And so they, this boundary is literally just the map of the boundary of the village, right? So this is the area that it covers, right? And the area itself was having increased cultivation, fragmentation, privatization, right? By Maasai themselves, even within the village, as well as increased poaching. And so they created a boundary around the most important grazing reserve, and it was a boundary that helped to keep outsiders out as opposed to Maasai out. It was a boundary that Maasai wanted themselves to designate as an important grazing area. Wildlife and livestock were allowed inside. So it was not a boundary that necessarily divided nature from society, but it sort of reevaluated what that boundary is going to look like. So farms were not allowed in, built structures were not allowed in, but livestock were. The boundary, sort of hierarchical sort of management, that was also sort of torn apart. It was completely Maasai managed. Maasai communication styles were the format through which meetings were held. Maasai villagers decide how the money is used. But of course, there are some sort of outside conservation techniques in terms of game scouts, particularly for protecting against poachers. But they're all based on local people doing the work. And then this is something that I'm writing about right now, this sort of history of trust, communication, and respect. And so it wasn't really about outsiders coming in. It was promoted and sort of pushed forward by an organization, a Maasai organization that's all about community rights in and around conservation areas. And the community liaison officer lives in that village. And then similarly, the Kitengela, and again, I don't know what's going to happen now that there's a train planned to go through Nairobi National Park, but this was a project that also was very much based on an understanding that Maasai have their own needs, and what are those needs, and we can listen to those needs, and from that build a project that in fact might work in this particular area. There were no boundaries drawn, but there was a focus on the work that New Boundaries is doing, and so there was a new fragmentation happening through land sales, through immigrants, through increased farming again, this fragmentation that's happening across the savanna lands. The International Livestock Research Institute worked with local researchers to map those borders and to show how they're fragmenting the landscape, and then worked with community members on sort of how we can start to take those borders down and reopen the landscape for grazing. There was a direct recognition of the border between Maasai ways of knowing and scientific ways of knowing, and an appreciation on an exchange dialogue across there that was facilitated again by a community liaison officer. And that's the paper in the PNAS paper is all about that, about sort of building this dialogue in order to increase knowledge flow and connect knowledge to action. Okay, so to sum up the updates, this is a really important update. Manyara Ranch has actually been returned to the villages. This happened recently, and this is an example of sometimes things actually do come around and work, but I would highlight that so community members have been fighting for the last 15 years probably. When I was there, they just realized that they had actually lost it. It's a whole long process it was a very sort of non-transparent, deceptive process. And I was there when they discovered it. I helped them to translate documents. My trust, relationship trust I had built really sort of helped me to kind of help the community. They recognized that I was sort of this border crosser, and that helped them. You know what the conservation agency wants and what they're saying. This is what we want. And so there was an appreciation of that. And I worked with them throughout the time I was there, helping them get access to lawyers, helping to sort of explain their grievances as well as their knowledge. Often got me threatened. I almost got kicked out of the country. In the end, it went back to them, not because of any real sort of activism, but because of political reasons. The former prime minister who ran for president is actually now hated by the current leadership, and so they want to destroy him. and he was profiting from the ranch. So, but it doesn't mean that they didn't get it, right? They got it now. It's theirs. The title's been returned to them. And so now the question is what's going to happen, right? And this is an area where most of my research is about turning the tables on who's an expert. So I'm not telling them that I can provide any expertise except for somebody that just watched the process for many years. And I'm in the current process of having my article on it translated into Swahili so more people can access it. But there's also conservation drones being used and they're just being experimented right now in this entire ecosystem. And I've already talked about the dangers that introduces, and I would suggest that all of you start to sort of think about drones, because I think they're going to radically transform all of the advances that have been made by community conservation. They're going to transform social relations when all of a sudden people are not having face-to-face relations, but they're being judged from above. They're going to reinforce this idea that we can see from above. They're going to reinforce notions of scientific authority. Then there's also conservancies in Kenya, right, which is another sort of place of hope, but also, I think, of caution. New kinds of arrangements that are being made where community members are deciding themselves how conservation should look on their own landscape. But of course, there are processes that are sort of deeply entrenched with politics, local political economies, and global ones as well. So I think I'm over now. I'm just going to wrap up with 2 slides, if that's okay. Just some concluding thoughts on how to kind of tie this back. I know I kind of went a little all over the map. But hopefully what came through is that there are ontological and epistemological differences, and that matters, right? There's different methodologies that we can use to get at those differences, but we need to start with a recognition that those differences exist. Otherwise, our methods can sometimes just reinforce them or sort of just dismiss them, right? And this is not about assuming that the differences are so big that we can't have dialogues, but recognizing that if we don't start with a recognition of difference, then we're going to sort of automatically, have a dialogue from a particular vantage point that's going to be potentially foreclosing or damaging. And if we focus on border crossings, then we can facilitate a more sort of I don't really want to use the word self-reflective, because I feel like that's a little bit too much navel-gazing, because it's not just self-reflective, where do I come from, but what institutions do I represent, and what are sort of some of the larger ramifications of this dialogue. But we can look at that in all of these different processes that we think might be solving the problem, because many times they actually just reinforce the boundary work itself, even something like co-production. And that forces us to focus on communication, on positionality, and on politics. And just to put up 2 Maasai quotes that kind of encompass this. One is, one head does not encompass all knowledge, right? So clearly we do need to bring together different ways of knowing. And then the boma, which is a homestead, which is not discussed, is not built. And so a focus again on dialogue and communication. And also to start with sort of understanding where the people that we're working with, how they see and live in the world. And then I'm going to just finish with a quote from Donna Haraway. Accounts of a real world do not depend on a logic of discovery, but on a power-charged social relation of conversation. The world neither speaks for itself nor disappears in favor of a master decoder. The codes of the world are not still, waiting only to be read. The world encountered in knowledge projects is an active entity. So, on that, and a Maasai quote that I think also summarizes that, I'm going to just end with a thank you. Sorry for being late.